Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a topic that's both juicy and educational, the intriguing and sometimes weird world of medieval sex. This era was all about knights in shining armor, but also about some pretty dubious herbal concoctions. When it came to getting a bit romantic, subtlety and hoping for some privacy were key. So before we get into all that, do me a favor and hit like if you enjoy my content and subscribe. Also, drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's really cool to see who's up and from where. Alright, let's set the mood. Maybe dim your lights or turn on a fan to have that gentle sound in the background. We're about to take a walk through history together. First off, let's bust a myth. The medieval times weren't all about luxurious settings with silk sheets and candles everywhere, accompanied by the soft strumming of a lute. The reality was way less glamorous. Most people lived in cramped homes that housed the whole family, including kids, elderly relatives, a couple of goats, and a very opinionated chicken. Privacy? That was a foreign concept. Most homes were essentially one big room with different areas for sleeping, cooking, and even housing animals, each with its own unique aroma. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to be pretty inventive. Timing was crucial, as was keeping the noise down, especially if the kids were asleep and, hopefully, not looking. Having curtains was seen as a bit of a luxury. Beds were shared, and even in wealthier families, servants might be sleeping right by the bed or awkwardly standing in a corner trying to ignore what was happening. Some families even kept records of who slept where for legal or religious reasons. Talk about uncomfortable. Traveling didn't make things any easier. Inns would often have communal beds, meaning total strangers could end up sleeping next to each other. So, if you were hoping for a bit of intimacy, you had to first check if the bed was already occupied and if the person next to you decided to keep their boots on. And if you were married, and if both parties were still up and not too dirty, you could share a mattress of straw and cross your fingers. If you weren't married, you had to be super quiet and extra careful. Small communities meant thin walls and fast-spreading gossip, quicker than plague rats even. Living in monasteries or convents, that was a whole different game. Absolutely no privacy, distractions, and definitely no late-night chats. But human nature being what it is, things got complicated sometimes. That's probably why many abbey gardens had really tall walls. The church had a massive influence on what went on in people's private lives, basically dictating what was okay and what wasn't behind closed doors, or, more like, behind shared curtains. According to the church, the main point of getting physical was to make more humans. That's it. Looking for pleasure, bonding, or a way to de-stress? According to them, you were either wasting your time or sinning. And they didn't just talk about this stuff on Sundays. Bishops, theologians, and confessors had a whole list of do's and don'ts, making sure nobody got creative. Certain days, major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and sometimes whole seasons were no-go zones. Thinking of getting cozy with your spouse during Lent or Advent? Better think again. That basically left you Tuesdays in April. Even married couples had a whole set of rules. They were supposed to keep things modest and restrained. Sure, showing affection was okay, but don't overdo it. Getting too passionate was, to put it lightly, not encouraged. There was this 13th century guide that advised married couples to be intimate without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Pretty much the least fun checklist ever. The missionary position was the gold standard, not just for its religious symbolism, but because it was seen as the most natural and least offensive to God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything more enthusiastic was looked at with suspicion. Confession booths probably heard all about it. Priests back in the day were pretty nosy, especially during confession. They didn't just ask about your spiritual life. They got really specific, digging into details about couples' private lives that they probably knew too much about. And while they were keen on knowing all the juicy details, how strictly they enforced the moral and ecclesiastical guidelines varied. Some areas were tough on the rules, while other priests might turn a blind eye. A lot of regular folks, especially peasants, would just go through the motions, agreeing during confession, but then doing their own thing in private. Trying to plan a romantic night wasn't easy in medieval times. You needed not just a calendar, but also a priest's okay and some serious luck. With the church dictating when couples could be intimate, spoiler, not on Sundays, Fridays, or Wednesdays, and definitely not during Lent, Advent, or on feast days, it's like the calendar was more about dodging spiritual no-nos than planning your next date. The church had lists, yes, actual lists, of days when intimacy was a no-go, which could knock out nearly half the year. If you got caught up in the moment on one of those off-limits days, you were in for a guilt trip and probably an extra round of confession. There's a story about a 13th century bishop who told off a married couple for getting together more than once a month, suggesting they focus on prayer instead. They weren't exactly happy about that advice. The upper class felt the squeeze of these rules more because they had all these spiritual advisors keeping tabs on them. But peasants? They played it a bit looser, fitting in their moments of affection when they could, and probably worrying a lot less about the church's calendar. Back in medieval Europe, people didn't have much time to stress about the specifics of holidays like the Feast of St. Nun. They were too busy trying to survive harsh weathers and ensure they didn't freeze to death. Plus, getting too cozy with your partner at the wrong time, like during Lent, could lead to all sorts of trouble. If the neighbors noticed, you might end up being the talk of the town or even get a sermon preached about you, complete with disapproving looks. When it came to romance, it wasn't like the fairy tales. Instead of dreamy dates and love poems, arranging a marriage was more about striking a deal. You wouldn't find much of the romantic stuff outside of stories and songs. Real life was about agreeing on who got what land, making sure families didn't start feuding, and maybe exchanging a daughter for peace or property. A bride's dowry might include anything from money to a piece of farmland. In return, the groom's family would hopefully agree to be somewhat pleasant. Dating, if it happened at all, was always under someone's watchful eye. Young lovers were hardly ever left alone. A girl's chaperone could be her mom, a strict aunt, or in some cases, the entire village keeping tabs on the couple. For the nobility, marriages were even more strategic, planned like moves in a chess game, with love being an afterthought. There's an old saying that sums it up: it's better to marry rich and grumpy than poor and cute. Romantic relationships in the days of yore were pretty pragmatic, especially among the peasant class. When choosing a partner, practicality ruled over passion. A man's appeal was often measured by his assets, think land, tools, or how hefty his ox was. As for women, their desirability was assessed based on their housekeeping prowess, reputation, and their ability to avoid stirring up trouble at the market. That's not to say love was off the table. It existed, but typically blossomed post-marriage rather than before. If a couple grew to love each other over time, that was a happy bonus, not a given. It's sort of like the emotional equivalent of downloadable content in video games, not part of the initial package, but a nice add-on if you could get it. Despite the rules, people found ways to add a little romance to their lives: secret flirtations, playful tunes, and sneaky strolls to the village well under the moonlight were the medieval version of dating. But those caught in the act, like stealing a kiss behind the barn, risked public shaming, a fine, or facing a very unimpressed dad wielding a pitchfork. Now onto debunking a big myth: chastity belts. You've likely seen them depicted in cartoons, historical dramas, or even spotted them in some awkward museum gift shop visits. These iron gadgets were said to be locked around a woman's waist by her husband, heading off to war, supposedly keeping her both physically and morally intact. But here's the catch. There's hardly any real historical proof that these were a thing during the Middle Ages. Most of the chastity belts we know of today are from the Renaissance or Victorian era, times that were more fascinated with the concept of medieval purity than what was historically accurate. Created as jokes, cautionary tales, or museum pieces, these belts were not the real deal. Medieval documents, which usually didn't shy away from the nitty-gritty, don't mention these belts at all. No tailor pitched them, no laws enforced them, and churches definitely didn't hand them out at weddings. It seems quite likely that, despite the rumors, chastity belts weren't a widespread medieval trend. Besides, considering the era's already dubious approach to hygiene, Strapping on a metal belt with no clear instructions seems like a particularly bad idea. There was this old belief that women in the medieval times wore chastity belts to prevent indiscretions, but in reality, a padlock down there was more likely to cause infections than stop any naughty business. The whole idea seems to have come from a mix of moral panic and satire that came later. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors were really into the idea of women being super repressed and controlled back in the day. They thought a woman with a lock on her underwear was the ultimate symbol of virtue. But truth be told, people back then had other ways to keep fidelity in check. They relied on shame, keeping an eye on each other, religious beliefs, and making smart marriage choices. Noble women were basically watched all the time, while peasant girls had the whole village keeping tabs on them. If there was any hint of scandal, it could lead to a lot of trouble, like losing your dowry or having to make really awkward confessions. And here's a fun fact. Medieval towns didn't just accept brothels, they regulated them. Yeah, in many parts of medieval Europe, especially the urban areas, brothels were legit businesses. Town councils would give them licenses, tax them, and even set up specific areas for them to operate. And this was all before the invention of the light bulb. Some cities had officials, known as brothel keepers, whose job was to manage these places. You can imagine that job title raised some eyebrows. The thinking behind this was pretty straightforward, albeit a bit cynical. Officials figured that if men had a legal way to satisfy their desires, it would lower the chances of worse things happening, like adultery, assault, or even dancing. So, regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil, kind of like how we view traffic signs or turnips. The church wasn't exactly on board with this, officially condemning it, but unofficially, some clergy members looked the other way. Some even made money off these establishments, which, if you think about it, is pretty hypocritical. Understanding medieval theology and how things worked back then is quite fascinating. Working in a brothel during those times wasn't a fairy tale, but it wasn't always a miserable existence either. Some women ended up in the profession by choice, mainly for economic reasons. This group often included widows or those without any family support. Others, however, were not so lucky and found themselves coerced or trafficked, especially in port cities where the influx of sailors meant more money but also more trouble. Believe it or not, there were even actual handbooks on how to run these establishments. They outlined everything from the importance of clean sheets and basic health inspections to setting specific hours for operation. People from all walks of life, including knights, apprentices, merchants, and yes, even monks, despite their vows, frequented these places. The costs varied, and services were listed out, sometimes with customers paying with whatever they had, like eggs or wool, rather than money. Now imagine a different scene. The soft glow of candlelight, a gentle breeze wafting through the thatched roof, and whispered sweet nothings. Then, a wool tunic comes off, revealing what can only be described as a powerful medieval musk. Personal hygiene back then was a whole different ballgame. While staying clean was important, it was way down on the list of priorities, somewhere after surviving plagues, fixing roofs, and chasing down the pig that escaped into the pantry. Bathing was a rare luxury. Peasants might bathe once a month, more if they accidentally fell into a river. Soap was a luxury, either homemade and sparingly used or expensive and imported. Public bathhouses did exist, but were sometimes shut down during disease outbreaks or scandals. Wealthy folks had the option of drawing a hot bath, scented with herbs, and even being pampered by attendants with linen cloths. The less fortunate had to make do with a cold bucket of water and hope nobody noticed their smell over the barnyard scents. To make things even more complicated, water, especially cold water, was sometimes viewed with suspicion. There was a belief that bathing too frequently could weaken the body. So, navigating personal hygiene in medieval Europe was no straightforward task. Back in the day, keeping clean was quite the challenge. Some folks had skin conditions that made bathing a risky affair, while others simply didn't have the time, the bathtub, or enough water that wasn't already claimed by local geese. Trying to make a good impression under these conditions wasn't easy. Perfume was a luxury for the elite. Deodorant was something people could only dream of. And dental care? Well, if you were fancy, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew on mint leaves. Kissing was definitely risky business, and clothes? They didn't help either. Imagine wearing layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur. These materials trapped heat, sweat, and all sorts of smells, including whatever was in the chamber pot or the stew of the day. Despite this, people still managed to fall in love and get cozy with each other. Maybe our standards were just different back then, or maybe love was truly blind and nose blind. When it came to family planning in medieval Europe, it was like trying to control a cart without wheels, reins, and a stubborn goat. Technically possible, but highly unreliable. Yet, people did try. They knew certain actions led to babies and took some unique, if not always logical, steps to avoid it. Some methods were somewhat scientific, involving herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals like burying objects near the doorstep. Others were more peculiar, like drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles or wearing amulets, hopefully blessed by someone knowledgeable. Some even believed that jumping up and down vigorously after being intimate could prevent pregnancy, which, at the very least, was a good workout. There were early attempts at barrier methods too. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one attempt. A few adventurous individuals experimented with wax, and there are hints at medieval versions of what would eventually evolve into modern latex devices. But let's not dive into the specifics of those early experiments. You really don't want to know what measures were made. The church, of course, wasn't happy about any of this. Back then, trying to avoid having kids was often seen as sinful or just plain wrong. Getting married? The main point was to have kids, and anything that messed with that plan was looked down upon, or more often, called out big time during church services. But not everyone listened to what the church said. Married couples, especially those who were struggling to make ends meet, often wanted to space out when they had their kids, or not have any more at all. And for couples who weren't married, well, the reasons to avoid pregnancy were even stronger. But no matter what they tried, most methods weren't exactly reliable. Birth control back then was pretty much guesswork, using local plants and a lot of hope. And when it didn't work, which happened a lot, you ended up with rushed weddings, hidden pregnancies, and tons of awkward talks. Despite what the church wanted people to believe, not every couple waited until they were married to get close. Testing things out before tying the knot wasn't rare, and it led to a lot of paperwork in the church, known as fornication records, and it was the talk of the town. Being intimate before marriage was kept an eye on. In towns all over Europe, officials kept records that were more about pointing fingers than anything else. If a couple got caught, or even just suspected of messing around before marriage, they could end up in court and have to pay a fine. Who got the money depended. Sometimes it was the church, other times the town, and occasionally someone who claimed they saw it happen. Yeah, medieval snitching was a thing. The fines varied. It depended on if it was your first time getting caught, if a pregnancy came from it, or if the couple ended up getting married. Sometimes, getting married could wipe the slate clean, like you had permission all along. Other times, you still had to pay, just maybe a little less. Think of it as an early bird special for breaking the rules. Let's talk about the social side of things in tight-knit communities where everyone knew each other's business. If the local priest decided to let you off the hook for something, your neighbors probably wouldn't. Gossip spread super fast, just like a meat pie going bad in the heat of July. A lot of times, this situation led to what's known as hand fasting. This was kind of like an informal way of getting engaged, where the couple would consider themselves promised to each other. In some places, this was all you needed to start living together. The church eventually tried to close this loophole, but by then, a lot of medieval kids were already born a bit sooner than planned. When it came to peasants, things were more straightforward. If a couple was serious and a pregnancy happened, marriage was the next step. Sometimes the families had to push them a bit, but it usually happened. For the nobles, though, the stakes were much higher. In the medieval era, being a virgin wasn't just a good thing. It was part of a contract, a way to use politics, and sometimes something the whole community was obsessed with. For common folks, expectations changed depending on where you were and the situation. A young woman was supposed to be a virgin when she got married, at least officially. If she wasn't, people might talk, and she could face a fine or a rushed marriage. But for noble women, their virginity was tied up with inheritance, alliances, and the family's honor. Breaking an engagement could start a feud, and a pregnancy outside of marriage could mess up plans that had been made for generations. So, how did they check if a woman was a virgin? Not very accurately. Sometimes it was all about vague statements like, "she seems virtuous," or "she mostly stayed away from the stable boy." Other times, they used more direct methods, like having midwives or matrons check for the hymen, which we now know doesn't actually prove anything about virginity. But back then, that didn't stop them. There were even cases where they tried to prove a woman's virginity after the wedding by showing blood-stained sheets, which, as you can imagine, was not a foolproof method. Back in the day, showing off a blood-stained sheet after the wedding night was like leaving a really awkward medieval Yelp review. This wasn't a worldwide thing, but in some places, it was pretty much expected. If the sheet wasn't stained, all hell could break loose, with lawsuits, annulments, and the kind of family drama that could rival any royal soap opera. Meanwhile, men didn't have to worry about proving their virginity. For them, being a virgin was seen as a nice-to-have, but not essential. At most, a guy might get a friendly warning to steer clear of tavern maids or people with loose morals, but nobody was inspecting their sheets the next day. Virginity was tied up with all this religious symbolism too. Young women were celebrated as pure and saintly, which sounds nice until you realize how much pressure that put on them. They grew up hearing stories about saints and martyrs, which were often pretty gruesome. And if a marriage ended because the bride wasn't a virgin, it wasn't just embarrassing. It could ruin her family's honor and mess with their property rights. So virginity in medieval Europe was a big deal, almost like a form of legal currency. As for whether people were into the same sex back then, the answer is definitely yes. Human nature hasn't changed much over the centuries, but acceptance? That's another story. Medieval society was all about religious rules, social roles, and who owned what. Officially, the church said no to same-sex relationships, lumping them in with other unnatural acts. Punishments for breaking the rules could range from a slap on the wrist to exile, depending on who you were and where you lived. But real life was always more complicated. Despite what the church had to say, we've found poems, letters, and even legal documents that hint at same-sex relationships. It's a reminder that people have always been people, with all the messy, beautiful diversity that entails. In medieval times, there were definitely some romantic, and at times physical, relationships happening between people of the same sex. Monks would exchange love letters that sounded more like declarations of longing than brotherly affection. Noblewomen might share beds and make promises of exclusive devotion in ways that would even make a troubadour blush. The social structures back then kind of blurred the lines too. With all-male monasteries and all-female convents, deep emotional bonds were formed. There were knightly brotherhoods filled with vows and language that was more affectionate than you might expect. Some historians aren't sure whether to label these relationships as romantic, platonic, or somewhere in between, but one thing is clear: there were strong feelings and possibly even poetry involved. Back then, the whole concept of sexual identity, like we understand today, just didn't exist. People didn't come out. They lived their lives carefully and quietly, often expressing themselves in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saints, stories, and some pretty intense pilgrimages that pairs would undertake together. When it comes to adultery in medieval Europe, it was a risky business. It was like juggling knives and handling a live chicken at the same time. Loud, risky, and likely to end with someone's pride or property taking a hit. Adultery wasn't seen just as a personal mistake, but as a social offense. Marriage was a big deal, considered a holy sacrament, legal contract, property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So an affair could mess with inheritances, dowries, and the delicate balance of local gossip. For women, the consequences of being caught in an affair were severe. They could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if they were caught with evidence. Noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Men, however, often had more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be frowned upon morally, but wouldn't usually face legal punishment unless the woman's family had powerful connections or the church got involved. That week, I was feeling particularly righteous. However, it's worth noting that not every cheater got off easily. In some towns, they faced hefty fines or had to make public confessions. There were even some legal records that mentioned rather unique punishments, like being paraded through the village wearing only a shift or having to pay for a new church bell, because apparently nothing speaks to divine justice quite like the sound of bronze. But the real danger for adulterers wasn't necessarily the law. It was the aggrieved husband. Honor killings, especially among the nobility, weren't uncommon. If a man found out his wife was cheating, medieval customs sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action, whatever that meant. And appropriate really depended on his social status and, frankly, how many swords he had at his disposal. For the rich, an affair could lead to massive scandals, complete with jewels, annulments, or even decade-long family feuds. Peasants, on the other hand, faced more financial repercussions, a fine here, a goat there, and a guaranteed spot in the local gossip mill. When it came to the idea of consent in medieval Europe, it was there, but not like we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic agreement. Instead, it was wrapped up in legal codes, dowries, church doctrine, and sometimes society just giving a collective shrug. For starters, medieval canon law did recognize consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was seen as valid if both parties verbally agreed to it, even without a priest. That meant two people saying "I will" in the middle of nowhere could technically be married. Romantic? Maybe. Legally confusing? Definitely. But here's the thing. Just because consent was a recognized concept didn't mean it was always respected, especially when it came to women. Noble daughters often had their marriages arranged like they were part of a peace treaty. Their opinions might be asked for courtesy or implied necessity, but at the end of the day, the dowry usually had the final say. Peasant women had more freedom of choice, but it still came with its own set of pressures. Saying no to a potential match could lead to economic hardship or social ostracism. Refusing the advances of someone from the local elite could have serious repercussions too. Reeves' son took an even riskier path within marriage, where the idea of consent became blurrier. Husbands legally had rights over their wives' bodies, and a wife's refusal could lead to complaints or even annulment. It was somewhat like owing a marital debt, which, despite sounding like something to do with money, was anything but voluntary. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Medieval courts did take action against coercion and assault, particularly if the victim had witnesses or the accused lacked influential connections. In cities like London or Paris, records show both women and men bringing their grievances to court, sometimes achieving justice or at least drawing attention to their cause. Then there's the literature of the time, which adds another layer to the conversation. Courtly love poetry, with its knights yearning for unattainable ladies and everyone dramatically fainting, shows that the concept of consent was recognized, even if it was often overlooked. This suggests that at the very least, they understood the importance of asking for consent. The medieval church's stance on physical pleasure, especially within marriage, was, to put it lightly, complicated. They viewed it with a lot of suspicion, ideally hoping that married couples weren't enjoying it too much. The church didn't ban marital relations outright. That would have been impractical for reasons like inheritance and population growth. Still, they strongly advocated for what can only be described as extreme moderation. Imagine being advised to engage in such activities once a month, in the dark, and without any smiles. Celibacy was held in high regard, with saints, monks, and nuns all practicing abstinence. Even married couples were sometimes encouraged to live as if they were celibate, particularly if they were older or sought a holier life. Choosing to give up intimacy could earn a couple high praise, or at least a nod towards spiritual dedication. Some, like St. Jerome, even argued that abstaining from marital relations was preferable, showcasing the extent of the church's idealization of celibacy. In the world of marriage back then, wanting your partner was seen as a no-no. The only reason couples were supposed to get together was to have kids. Enjoying it, feeling close, or even thinking your partner looked good in their night clothes was off limits. This strict view even made its way into confession booths, where priests would awkwardly ask people if they'd been too into their spouse. Imagine how uncomfortable that must have been. But even with all these rules, life went on. Whether they were farmers, shopkeepers, or nobles, most people would nod along to what the church said, then go home and live as they pleased, finding comfort in each other's company after a hard day's work. For those who were super serious about their faith, there were couples who chose to live together without any physical stuff, focusing on prayer instead. They saw giving up on their desires as a way to be closer spiritually. Now, considering everything from the church's strict views, the penalties for flirting, and even the skepticism around taking a bath, you might wonder if love was even a thing back then. The answer? Absolutely. Love managed to sneak its way in, no matter how much society tried to keep it out. Peasants flirted in the fields, nobles shared poems and sneaky looks at fancy dinners, while pretending to be interested in falconry. Even monks and nuns got in on the action, writing letters that had so much emotion, we're still trying to figure out what they meant. The stories and songs from that time are filled with love stories. Troubadours sang about ladies who made knights want to go out and get hurt in their honor. The whole idea of courtly love was about wanting someone so bad it hurt, making love not just possible, but passionate, even in the strictest of times. Falling for someone married to your boss, especially from afar, was a surefire way to experience unrequited love. But let's face it, that kind of love often inspired the most heartfelt poetry. Love wasn't always out of reach, though. History tells us about peasants who ran off together to avoid arranged marriages, and nobles who chose love over wealth, shocking their families and their accountants. The church played a role in love too, insisting that both the bride and groom verbally consent to the marriage, even if they were less than thrilled about it. Once married, couples often built strong relationships, working together, raising children, and facing life's challenges, like plagues and taxes, side by side. The love and commitment between spouses are evident in the letters they exchanged, especially when they were apart. Even widows and widowers, after losing a spouse, sometimes chose to remarry for love or companionship, picking partners who they genuinely liked. Then there's the story of Zeno of Citium, a wealthy merchant who seemed to have everything, until he didn't. His fleet, filled with precious cargo, was destroyed by a storm near Athens, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. Broke and lost, Zeno ended up in Athens, where he stumbled into a bookshop in the Athenian Agora. There, he discovered a book that contained the teachings of Socrates, setting him on a path far removed from his previous life as a merchant. This twist of fate led him to something much more lasting than material wealth. Zeno was fascinated by the powerful ideas he found in a book, leading him to ask the bookseller where he could find someone like Socrates. The answer was right in front of him, in the form of Crates, a grumpy, stooped philosopher who walked by. Crates wasn't just any philosopher. He was a cynic known for his dramatic rejection of wealth and material possessions, even going as far as throwing his money into the sea to make a point. Initially, Zeno found it hard to adapt to such an extreme lifestyle. He wasn't prepared to embrace poverty for the sake of philosophy. However, Crates managed to plant a seed in Zeno's mind, a seed that eventually grew into a revolutionary way of thinking. Over time, Zeno developed his own philosophy, blending Socratic ethics, cynic discipline, and the logical rigor of thinkers like Heraclitus. He started teaching in the Stoa Poikile, or painted porch, in Athens. This wasn't a fancy place, it was a public porch adorned with murals. Interestingly, this is where Stoicism got its name, not from some elite institution, but from a humble, accessible porch. This origin story speaks volumes about Stoicism itself. It's a philosophy that emerged not from affluence, but from adversity, not from a palace, but from a place of humility. Stoicism, from the start, was about helping people deal with life's challenges, not avoiding them. Zeno, having survived his own personal disasters, including a shipwreck and the loss of everything he owned, didn't just start teaching. He redefined what it meant to live a good life. At the core of his teaching was the concept of logos. For the Stoics, logos meant more than just reason. It was seen as the divine rational structure that orders the universe, a sort of cosmic blueprint. They believed everything happened for a reason, even if humans couldn't always understand it. The world, as chaotic as it might seem, had an underlying order. By aligning one's thoughts with this cosmic order, one could achieve peace, clarity, and moral strength. Zeno and his followers argued that virtue, or arete in Greek, was the only true good, not fame, wealth, or even physical health. These were considered indifferent, things that might not necessarily contribute to living a good life. Having nice things is cool, but it doesn't really say anything about who you are as a person. What really shows your character is how you deal with the tough stuff life throws at you. This is essentially what being stoic is all about. Life can be chaotic, but if you're stoic, you stay calm in the storm. It's not about having no feelings, but about being strong and steady no matter what happens. You can't control everything, like what people say or do, but you can control how you react, how you think, and what you do. Back in the day, and honestly even now, a lot of people are all about chasing things like comfort, fame, or money. Stoicism, though, suggests a different way to live. It's about being in tune with nature, accepting what life throws at you without getting upset about it, and focusing on being a good person rather than just feeling good. They used to say, life is like being a dog tied to a cart. You can either run alongside it happily or get dragged along grudgingly. Either way, the cart is moving forward. It's your choice how you deal with it. Zeno, the guy who started all this Stoic stuff, didn't keep his ideas to himself. He had students who would hang out at the Stoa, which is basically a porch, and talk about how to be the best version of themselves. This simple porch chat grew into one of the strongest philosophies in history, outliving many empires. But here's the thing. Philosophy isn't just about talking or thinking, it's about doing. The next big name in Stoicism was Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought a new level of toughness to the philosophy. Before he got into all the deep thinking, he was literally fighting for a living. But when he found Stoicism, he discovered a different kind of strength. Unlike the kind you get from working out, this strength was for the soul. Cleanthes had a tough job at night and studied philosophy during the day. He was all about hard work and proving that true virtue comes from overcoming obstacles, not from being born into an easy life. He lived the Stoic belief that talking about theories isn't enough. You have to live them, especially when it comes to facing challenges head-on. Cleanthes had a way of greeting every sunrise with grace. His most famous piece, the Hymn to Zeus, was a poetic nod to logos, which is the idea of a divine rationality that organizes everything. But it wasn't just religious praise, it was his way of calmly acknowledging the cosmic order. Everything Cleanthes penned was part of a bigger picture, even the tough stuff. His approach to Stoicism was unshakable, like a glacier, quiet, massive, and firmly in place. He also added a new layer of emotion to Stoicism, something his predecessor Zeno, who focused more on logic and detachment, didn't do. Cleanthes thought that feeling awe towards nature or a love for wisdom was okay, as long as it was reasonable. He wasn't promoting indulgence, just a balance. He believed there was no point in a philosophy that made you emotionless. Despite not being a big show-off or drawing crowds with catchy phrases, in fact, some people even made fun of him for speaking slowly, Cleanthes had a solid presence. In the world of Stoicism, being consistent was crucial, and he embodied this principle more than anyone. When he took over from Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, it wasn't because he was outgoing, but because he truly lived by Stoic values. His life demonstrated that it was possible to face tough times without becoming bitter, to question life without anger, and to stay humble without letting go of ambition. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism developed resilience. It wasn't about getting applause, but about having the inner strength to stand tall when everything else seemed unstable. Then, Chrysippus came along and refined Stoicism even further. He turned what started as a simple idea into a comprehensive philosophy. If Zeno was the founder and Cleanthes added strength, Chrysippus provided the structure. He was incredibly productive, writing over 700 books, most of which have been lost. His work was crucial in making Stoicism one of the most solid philosophical systems of the ancient world. Chrysippus was tireless and took the school to new heights, ensuring its teachings were well-defined and impactful. Cleanthes took over where Zeno left off, but with his own twist. While Zeno was more reserved and Cleanthes was more about the arts, Chrysippus was like a surgeon with his specialty in logic. In an era where most philosophers were all about showy speeches or tugging at heartstrings, Chrysippus was busy crafting a system of reasoning that could go toe-to-toe with Aristotle's. He was all about the details. To him, for Stoicism to last, it couldn't just ride on someone's charm or old traditions. It had to be rock solid, no gaps, and no unnecessary extras. He took the Stoic idea of distinguishing what's in our control and what's not, and he ran with it. He expanded on their ethics, metaphysics, and physics, making it all fit together in a way that was tough to argue with, but also hard to grasp. Chrysippus was firm in his belief that being virtuous was all you needed to be happy. You didn't need comfort or a bunch of friends to add to your virtue. Just virtue, and that's it. One of his biggest ideas was the lekton, which was all about the meaning in our words. He figured that every word we say has a syllable, a piece of content that's tied to logic and carried through speech. It's a bit of a head-scratcher, but it really helped deepen the Stoic view on logic and clarity, which they thought was crucial for living a good life. But Chrysippus wasn't just some Stoic figure with no personality. He had a sharp sense of humor. There's a story where someone called him out for not living up to his teachings, and he shot back with, "Would you fault a doctor for getting sick? He still knows how to cure the illness." So, despite his serious contributions to philosophy, Chrysippus could definitely hold his own in a battle of wits. Stoicism isn't about acting like you've got everything figured out. It's really about trying your best every single day to make sure your actions line up with what you believe in. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism got a bit tougher. It turned into more than just a comforting thought for unlucky travelers or creative types. It became a real discipline, something you could learn, practice, and use to make sense of life's confusion and chaos. This way of thinking didn't stay put in Greece for long. It soon found its way to Rome, catching the attention of both emperors and slaves, all of whom found its teachings powerful. By the time it reached Rome, Stoicism had already been through a lot of changes, but once there, it shifted from being a Greek brain exercise to a practical Roman lifestyle, perfect for politicians, military leaders, and even emperors. The Romans were all about practical solutions. They were dealing with wars, backstabbing, and all kinds of personal disasters. They needed a way to keep their cool when everything else was falling apart. Stoicism, with its emphasis on controlling yourself and being virtuous even when things are crazy, was just what they needed. Enter Seneca the Younger, a philosopher, playwright, and someone who ended up giving advice to Nero, one of the most unpredictable emperors Rome had. Seneca wasn't some poor guy who had it tough from the start. He was rich, well-educated, and close to the center of power. But his writings show he knew how easily life could go wrong, and how tempting it is to just take the easy route. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, Seneca talked a lot about keeping things simple, being mindful, and not letting your desires control you. But his own life was full of contradictions. He wrote about living simply while enjoying wealth. He talked about virtue while working for Nero. But these contradictions don't make him a hypocrite, they make him more human. Seneca never claimed to be perfect. He knew he was flawed, calling himself not a wise man, but a lover of wisdom. Maybe the real essence of being Stoic is not about claiming to have mastered it all, but being on a continuous journey to learn and grow humbly. Seneca introduced Stoicism to the elite, but another Roman, Epictetus, brought it to the masses. Epictetus wasn't your typical teacher. He was a former slave, crippled and poor, owning nothing, not even his freedom. Yet, he believed and taught that true freedom is something that comes from within. He famously said, "You may chain my leg, but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." For him, life's tough moments weren't just hurdles. They were opportunities to cultivate virtue. His teachings, which were kept alive by his student Arrian, turned into a sort of Stoic guidebook for finding inner freedom. In Rome, Stoicism transformed into more than just a philosophy. it became a form of mental armor. This was especially true for Marcus Aurelius, an emperor, a warrior, and perhaps most surprisingly, a philosopher king. Marcus Aurelius found himself in a unique position, not just learning about philosophy in a peaceful oasis, but applying it in the chaos of war and the challenges of ruling an empire that was starting to show cracks. Becoming the emperor of Rome in 161 CE, Marcus was born into incredible privilege. However, his time as emperor was marked by anything but ease. Plagues ravaged his empire, Germanic tribes posed constant threats, his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, died prematurely, his generals turned against him, and his son Commodus was shaping up to be the tyrant he had always feared. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus Aurelius didn't focus on grand speeches or propaganda. Instead, he penned personal notes to himself, which were later gathered into meditations. These weren't meant for the public eye, but were intimate musings of a man under immense pressure, trying to remind himself of the person he aimed to be. He advised himself to start each day prepared for challenges like interference, ungratefulness, insults, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. Marcus didn't see himself as a pessimist, rather he saw his mindset as a form of preparation. He believed that by anticipating difficulties, he could deal with them without losing his way. To Marcus, the negative actions of others weren't personal insults, but merely showed their lack of understanding. He felt it was not his job to control other people, but to master his own reactions and behaviors. Reminding himself that life could end at any moment, he chose to live with purpose, not out of fear, but with clear intention. This mindset wasn't about despair, it was about having a clear vision of reality. Despite his role as a powerful leader, commanding legions and ruling over a vast empire, Marcus was deeply focused on his inner world. He believed it was possible to stay calm amidst chaos if one kept their mind focused on reason and virtue. Cruelty wasn't something he indulged in, and opulence was something he rejected. Even though he wasn't always able to live up perfectly to the ideals of Stoicism, he constantly referred back to them, using them as a guide through the storms of life. Marcus Aurelius might not have been the creator of Stoicism, but he embodied its principles more publicly than anyone before him. His life demonstrated that Stoicism was not just for philosophers or monks living in seclusion. It was a practical philosophy for anyone, including those in positions of great power, who sought peace amidst the tumult of life. However, after Marcus's death in 180 CE, Stoicism began to fade into the background. It didn't disappear but lost its prominence within Roman intellectual circles. This decline was partly due to political changes. Marcus's son, Commodus, took over the empire and quickly began to dismantle the Stoic virtues his father stood for. Under Commodus, the Roman court turned into a spectacle of excess, with little room for philosophy. At the same time, Christianity was on the rise, spreading through the Roman Empire and eventually becoming the state religion. Its theology, rituals, and worldview started to overshadow ancient philosophies like Stoicism, which emphasized self-reliance. Christianity brought a different perspective to the table, focusing on divine grace and redemption, which contrasted with Stoicism's acceptance of fate and emphasis on the will of God. While Christian thinkers often viewed Stoicism as a noble but incomplete pagan system, they didn't dismiss it entirely. Instead, Stoicism's key ideas slowly made their way into early Christian thought, finding admirers among many church fathers. For instance, Augustine, despite his criticisms of Stoic pride, appreciated their commitment to moral seriousness. Furthermore, Christian monastic traditions, particularly those centered around ascetic practices, found a lot in common with Stoic ideals of discipline. Practices such as silence, simplicity, denial of luxury, and self-examination mirrored the teachings of Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Seneca. During the medieval era, Stoicism settled into a background role, respected by scholars and monks but not widely practiced. It transformed into a quiet influence that lingered in the margins, kept alive by theologians and the curious. However, this survival meant that Stoicism was poised for a comeback when the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods sparked new interest in ancient philosophies. Its principles, having been subtly integrated into Western thought, were ready to resurface. Suddenly, Stoicism was everywhere, not just in academic circles, but in self-help books, leadership seminars, and even podcasts. This ancient philosophy had made a remarkable transition, finding a new audience in the digital age, appealing to those seeking clarity and resilience amid modern life's distractions and pressures. By the 20th century, philosophers like Pierre Hadot were uncovering Stoicism's layers, showcasing its enduring relevance. Stoicism's resurgence wasn't marked by grand declarations, but through blogs, books, and podcasts, signaling its unexpected yet profound influence on contemporary culture. Stoicism is more than just a set of ideas. It's a way to live life. It's not about being unemotional or severe, but about being thoughtful and finding healing through reflection. Hadot pointed out that ancient philosophies like Stoicism were meant to be practiced as a form of spiritual discipline. They were about living the principles, not just reading them. This perspective resonated with people, sparking a resurgence in interest. In the early 2000s, writers like Ryan Holiday played a big part in bringing Stoicism into the mainstream. He wrote books such as The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy, which presented Stoicism as a set of practical tools for dealing with life's challenges. By drawing on the teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, Holiday showed how Stoicism could help with everything from starting a business to getting through a tough day. Tech leaders and entrepreneurs, including Tim Ferriss and Naval Ravikant, began to see Stoic texts as guides to efficient and effective living. The appeal was clear. In a fast-moving, surface-level world, Stoicism offered a promise of inner peace, self-control, and clear thinking. Even mental health professionals noticed the value in Stoic principles, incorporating them into cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The therapies focus on challenging thoughts, managing what's within our control, and not being led by emotions echoes Stoic teachings. However, the modern embrace of Stoicism wasn't without its critics. Some argued that its depth had been reduced to catchy, motivational sayings, losing some of its original richness and humility. Despite this, Stoicism's core message has stood the test of time because it addresses a fundamental human need to find stability and meaning in the face of life's uncertainties. Stoicism teaches that while we can't always control what happens to us, we have the power to control how we respond and what we become. Today, Stoicism finds itself in a unique position. It's an ancient philosophy that continues to offer valuable insights for modern lives. It provides guidance on how to navigate a world that seems more complex and chaotic than ever. In this way, Stoicism bridges the gap between past and present, demonstrating that some wisdom is truly timeless. Nowadays, we live in a world that seems to be obsessed with constant noise. When you scroll through social media, you might stumble upon a quote from Marcus Aurelius nestled between cat videos and stock tips. Even when you check out the bestseller list, there it is again, the Daily Stoic, ready to serve as your morning mental vitamin. It's pretty surprising that Stoicism, a philosophy from 2,300 years ago, is now trending. But the reason Stoicism has become popular isn't that it's just a trend. It's because it speaks directly to a specific need we have today: finding mental clarity amid all the confusion. In our current world, where everything feels out of control, be it the economy, relationships, climate, or algorithms, Stoicism offers a guiding light inward. It teaches us to shift our focus from the external chaos to what we can control: our choices. The core questions Stoicism asks us are timeless. What is in your control? What kind of person do you choose to be, no matter the circumstances? Unlike some philosophies that suggest withdrawing completely from the world, Stoicism encourages engagement. It tells us to go to work, raise our families, and serve our communities, but to do so from a place of calm and not out of craving. It's about taking action, yes, but action that's grounded. In this way, Stoicism is like a quiet rebellion. It's not about making a big show of resistance, but rather, it's a silent stand against being impulsive, getting distracted, and succumbing to emotional chaos. Stoicism teaches the discipline to pause before reacting, the courage to remain kind even in harsh times, and the humility to recognize that while we're not the center of the universe, we are responsible for how we navigate through it. People from various walks of life are finding value in this ancient wisdom. Athletes use it to handle pressure, veterans to process trauma, CEOs to lead without letting their egos get in the way, and teenagers, drowning in the constant flow of comparison and digital noise, find solace in the words of Epictetus. It's important to note that Stoicism isn't a magic solution. You'll still experience grief, make mistakes, and sometimes lose your temper. However, Stoicism offers a valuable framework to help you get back up, reflect, and move forward. Ultimately, Stoicism isn't about striving for perfection. It's focused on making quiet, steady, and internal progress. In a society that often values loudness, perhaps the most revolutionary act is to embrace stillness. Stoicism is making a comeback because it provides simple clarity in a complicated world, teaching us to find peace within ourselves amidst the external chaos. Visiting an ancient Roman bath could feel like stepping into a luxury resort, with its marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and statues of gods around steaming pools under the morning sun. But for a Roman, this was just a regular day. Bathing was not a rare indulgence. It was a daily ritual, a crucial aspect of Roman life. At the height of the empire, Rome boasted over 900 public baths, ranging from lavish imperial complexes to simple neighborhood spots. Everyone, from senators to shoemakers, found time for a bath. It wasn't just about cleanliness. The rhythm, the routine, the conversation, and the heat were all part of the experience. The bathing process was thoughtful and structured. You'd start in the apoditarium, or changing room, where slaves might assist the wealthier visitors in undressing. Next, you'd move to the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores and started the relaxation process. Then came the caldarium, the experience's core, a hot, steamy room heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaust. Here, bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils, curved metal tools, and sometimes get a massage. The final step was a plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool that tightened the skin and revived the senses. This transition from hot to cold, from sweating to chilling, was what made the ritual so effective. Romans believed it improved circulation, digestion, and mood, and they were probably onto something. But the baths were about more than just hygiene or health. They were about community. You went there to see and be seen, to gossip, work, debate politics, make business deals, or just listen in on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians, others snacks. Poets recited verses while philosophers debated, all under domed ceilings filled with laughter and steam. In a way, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status was acknowledged, but even emperors could find themselves sharing a room with commoners. Slaves and women might have had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were integral to this daily social ritual. For Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about maintaining a routine, ensuring health, participating in society, and embracing a certain rhythm of life. A visit to the baths was a glimpse into the heart of Roman culture, where the daily act of cleansing was just as much about social connection and communal life as it was about personal hygiene. In ancient Rome, individuals often became of something much bigger than themselves, blending into the vast empire's rhythm, one steamy breath at a time. The Roman baths stand out, not just because they were grand, but because they showcased the Romans' incredible engineering skills. Way before our time, with our saunas and underfloor heating, the Romans had already mastered the art of turning bricks, fire, and water into a luxurious wellness retreat. The secret behind this innovation was the hypocaust system, a precursor to modern central heating. Underneath the hot room's floors, slaves would keep a furnace, known as the profernium, ablaze. This fire warmed up a space beneath the floor, which was held up by small pillars. Hot air from the fire would travel through this space and up into the walls through flues, spreading warmth throughout the room efficiently, without filling it with smoke. The design of the baths was clever in other ways, too. Vaulted ceilings kept the heat in, while domes spread out the sound. A smart layout of different rooms controlled the temperature, from the cooler frigidarium to the hot caldarium. Windows were strategically placed to catch the sun, and the water system was a marvel of its time, always keeping the water flowing, clean, and heated just right. And then there were the aqueducts, the unsung heroes of the Roman Empire. These towering stone channels brought huge amounts of water into cities, making it possible for bath complexes even far from water sources to operate all year round. Some of the largest baths could use millions of liters of water in a single day. but thanks to the efficiency of the aqueducts, waste was minimal. The water wasn't just for bathing. The Romans also had steam rooms, saunas, and even early versions of flushing toilets. Wastewater and sewage were efficiently removed through an underground drainage system, all powered by gravity. But these baths weren't just standalone wonders. They were a key part of the Roman urban landscape. Keeping them running required a lot of work. Workers known as fornicatores kept the furnaces burning, while others cleaned the pools, stocked up on wood, or fixed tiles and plumbing. It was a huge, labor-intensive operation, but clearly the Romans thought it was worth it. The rewards of Roman architecture were undeniable. These buildings weren't just temporary structures. Many of them stood strong for centuries. Imagine living in a time without electricity, industrial machinery, or the convenience of digital thermostats, yet still experiencing seamless heat, comfort, and flow. This was the reality of entering a Roman bath. It was more than just stepping into a building. It was stepping into an ingeniously designed system, powered by fire, sustained by water, and crafted by sheer genius. But Roman baths were far more than places for physical cleansing. They were bustling hubs of information in a world without smartphones, email, or newspapers. Think of them as open-air broadcast centers where gossip didn't just trickle down, it flowed freely. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets would mingle, shedding their togas and inhibitions, and conversations would spread as quickly as fire. From the latest scandals to political plots, if you wanted the scoop on what was happening in Rome, the baths were the place to be. This wasn't by accident. The Roman elite knew very well that the baths were public arenas, and they capitalized on this. Politics didn't pause at the Senate doors. They seeped into the steamy air of the baths. It was a place where strategies were whispered between the steam clouds, where a patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room to propose an alliance, or where a patron and client could meet to discuss loyalty or threats while relaxing in the pool. Even emperors got in on the act. Famous figures like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius made it a point to visit the public baths, not just as a routine, but as a calculated move to appear accessible and invested in the welfare of the common people. Of course, they had their private bathing areas, but showing up in the public spaces sent a clear message. I'm still one of you, sort of. And it wasn't all politics. Business deals were struck, poets recited their latest works, and philosophers engaged in debates over ethics, all within the echoey confines of these public baths. The atmosphere was charged with more than just steam. It was a melting pot of Roman society, where every visit could mean coming away with a piece of news, a new ally, or even a new idea. Domed rooms were really good at making voices louder, which was great for anyone who wanted to be heard. The bathhouse in Rome was like their own version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor all wrapped into one. It was a place where everyone was buzzing, showing off, but also getting down to serious business. Big decisions on things like military moves, money matters, and personal issues often started there, away from the more official places. Since everyone was pretty much in the same boat, wearing little and just chilling, it was easier for true colors to show. And amidst all the steam, the real plans of the empire were quietly shared. Bathing wasn't just about staying clean or looking good for the Romans. It was seen as a key to staying healthy and was a big part of their approach to medicine. Doctors, philosophers, and even the military were all for it. The whole process of hot baths, cold dips, sweating, and massages was thought to clean out your system and keep your body's fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, in check. They believed that if these fluids were out of balance, you'd get sick, but the right routine at the baths could fix you up. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. The hot rooms opened up your pores, relaxed your muscles, and helped with blood flow. Jumping into cold water after that helped reduce swelling and wake your senses up. They even had a special tool to scrape off all the gunk on your skin, followed by massages with scented or olive oils. We might call it detoxing or hydrotherapy today, but for them, it was just a normal day. The bigger bath complexes were pretty advanced too. They sometimes had small medical clinics where doctors, often with Greek training, would check you out and give advice or suggest changes to your diet. If you were dealing with a cough, sore joints, or stomach issues, your doctor might tell you to hit a specific part of the baths or tweak how you bathed. Exercise was also part of the mix, with many bathhouses offering spaces for getting a workout in. In ancient Rome, staying active was a big part of daily life, especially when it came to their bathhouses. Before starting their bathing routine, Romans would engage in physical activities like boxing, wrestling, fencing, or playing ball games in open courtyards attached to the baths. The idea was to get a good sweat going before moving on to the steam rooms. For them, maintaining health was an active pursuit, involving both physical and mental efforts. They believed in working hard for their well-being, doing everything from push-ups to plunges. Mental health was also on their radar. The bathhouse experience, with its slow and deliberate transitions from one room to another, was seen as a way to encourage reflection and clear the mind. Famous thinkers of the time, like the Stoics and Epicureans, often talked about the baths as places where one could find mental clarity and control over their emotions. In this sense, Roman baths were much more than just places to get clean. They were the ancient world's version of a wellness center, complete with exercise, socializing, and healing, all wrapped up in an environment that was both beautiful and gossipy. For the Romans, a healthy body was more than just a personal goal. It was seen as the bedrock of moral virtue, mental clarity, and physical strength. And the bathhouse was where this journey toward wellness started. Entering a Roman bathhouse was like stepping into another world, one filled with beauty and designed to impress and relax visitors. From the get-go, in the apoditerium or changing room, you'd be surrounded by luxury. From the vividly painted frescoes depicting myths or landscapes, to the marble benches and the music playing softly in the background as a servant took care of your sandals. The baths themselves were marvels of architecture and design. The tepidarium, or warm room, served as the welcoming area and was often the most elaborately decorated, with high ceilings, colorful mosaics, and natural light filtering through large windows. This room might be circular or rectangular, with domed or coffered ceilings supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. Then there was the caldarium, the hot room, where heated pools and steam filled the air, complete with bronze or terracotta braziers and sometimes even gilded taps for heated water. The warm floors were just another luxurious touch in these impressive spaces. Thanks to the ingenious design of the Roman baths, the air shimmered with heat, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Decorative touches like fountains and statues of gods such as Apollo, Venus, and Hercules brought a divine elegance to the place. The frigidarium, known for its cool serenity, often took the spotlight with its large cold pool. This pool mirrored the ceiling above, which dazzled with painted stars or geometric patterns, and the water sparkled, sometimes catching beams of sunlight from skylights or open oculi, creating a mystical effect. This room, in contrast to the lively chatter of the previous ones, was enveloped in a peaceful stillness. The Roman baths were a feast for the senses, designed to awe everyone who entered. The lavish use of imported marble, colorful tilework, and sophisticated geometry was more than just for show. It symbolized the essence of the empire, order, refinement, and a bold extravagance. Even the smaller, local baths were crafted with care, featuring mosaics that playfully warned bathers with phrases like cave canum, beware of the dog, or balneum gratum, the bath is pleasant, adding a touch of humor. These spaces were crafted to delight the eye, soothe the spirit, and serve as a reminder of the grandeur of Roman civilization, all before you even stepped into the water. While the Roman baths were technically public spaces, not everyone experienced them in the same way. They mirrored the broader society, with social divisions subtly maintained. For instance, in the grand bath complexes, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, emperors might share the same space as the common folk. However, the reality was that social distinction remained. The wealthy often came with an entourage of slaves to attend to their needs, and they could afford private massages or other exclusive services. Some baths even had special sections reserved for the upper class. And while you might find yourself swimming next to a senator, striking up a conversation wasn't the norm. Gender segregation was another aspect of the baths. Men and women typically bathed separately, maintaining the social norms of the time. This separation and the entire structure of the baths reflected the complex layers of Roman society, where the lines of class and gender were both blurred and deeply ingrained. Back in the day, Roman bathhouses had different rules about who could bathe and when. Some emperors were strict about keeping men and women separate, like Hadrian, but others, like Commodus or Elgabalus, were cool with everyone mixing together, which didn't sit well with the more old-fashioned folks. Whether women could get in depended on the place, the time, and what the local officials felt like. In the richer cities, women had their own fancy bathhouses, but in less wealthy places, they usually had to get in early in the morning before the men showed up. Not all women had it easy, though. If you weren't high status, you might have to deal with a lot of rules, judgment, and side-eye. Slaves and freedmen were a big part of the crowd at these bathhouses. They were often encouraged to come, especially if they did hard work. But they usually came at less busy times or used simpler facilities. Despite that, many slaves worked at the bathhouses as attendants, masseurs, or keeping the fires going. Some of them got pretty well known for their skills and charm. As for people from outside Rome, like foreigners, non-citizens, and folks from the provinces, they were generally welcome in Roman bathhouses, especially when the empire was at its peak. The Romans spread their bath culture to the places they conquered, using it as a way to bring people into the fold. It was like their way of saying, "Welcome to Rome, now take your clothes off." Yeah, so the Roman baths were a kind of shared space. But how much you enjoyed it really depended on who you were. Just like in the forums or the Senate, there were social hierarchies. But for a moment when you were there, surrounded by mist, feeling the heat from the hot stones, and diving into cold water, those social lines seemed to fade away. And that's what made it so special. Bathing was the main reason people went to the baths. But these places were about so much more than just getting clean. They were like the ancient version of a leisure center. You could hit the gym for a bit, catch a show, or just hang out and chat with friends. You could easily spend the whole afternoon there, and many people did. The bigger bath complexes had everything. After working out in the palestra, which was a courtyard for wrestling, boxing, or playing ball games, you might wander over to the library next door. Yep, a lot of baths had their own libraries where you could chill with a scroll from Cicero or Virgil. It was all about keeping both your body and your mind in shape. Music was a big deal too. You might hear live flute, harp, or vocal performances echoing around the place. Some folks would be relaxing by a fountain or getting an oil rub down, all while being serenaded. The baths even hired professional entertainers, from acrobats to comedians, to keep everyone in a good mood. If you got hungry, there were food stalls and snack counters close by, especially in the changing rooms, known as the apodyterium. They sold wine, bread, olives, cheese, and dried fruits. If you were more well-off, your personal slaves might bring you fancier dishes or exotic treats from nearby villas. So yeah, you could be eating grapes in the steam room, living like an emperor, though how you behaved food-wise varied by place. Gambling was a hit too. People played dice games, bet on athletic matches, or made casual bets with friends. It added a bit of excitement and mischief to the atmosphere. These activities weren't exactly legal, but they were tolerated. The baths were a place to unwind, after all. And then, there were the more private spaces. Some rooms were like private lounges or even brothels, catering to those looking for intimate encounters. The idea that spending time in steamy, dimly lit spaces like the Calarium, a hot room in Roman baths, might seem a bit morally ambiguous by today's standards. But back in Roman times, people had a totally different take on things like public spaces, privacy, and sensuality. The vibe of these places, with all the steam and dim lighting, was actually part of their appeal. One of the most impressive things the Romans did wasn't just building a huge empire. They also managed to make the Roman way of life a standard thing over thousands of miles. This included their famous baths. Whether it was in the misty highlands of Britannia, the deserts of North Africa, the forests of Gaul, or the sands of Syria, finding a Roman bath wasn't unusual. It was like a symbol that showed you were in Roman territory. Wherever Roman soldiers and engineers went, they didn't just stop at building roads and forts. They made sure to construct baths too. But these baths weren't just copy-paste jobs. They took into account local resources and traditions, although they kept the typical Roman design with rooms for undressing, apoditerium, warm baths, tepidarium, hot baths, calarium, and cold baths, frigidarium. In chillier places like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms got a lot of love. In hotter spots like North Africa or the Levant, they added more shaded areas and cool pools to beat the heat. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jash in Jordan, and Bath in England boasted some pretty fancy bathhouses, complete with mosaics, sculptures, and shout-outs to the emperor's generosity. These places weren't just about taking a dip. They were a way for Rome to show off, a kind of propaganda made out of marble and steam. Every time locals used these facilities, they got a reminder of the message: this is Rome, and Rome looks after its own. Bathhouses were about more than just getting clean. They were a key part of cultural integration. When Rome conquered new territories, the bathhouse was where people from these areas got a gentle introduction to Roman customs. Imagine this: you could keep speaking your language at home, but the moment you undressed and entered the steamy rooms, you were taking part in a Roman tradition. This tradition didn't care where you were from or what your background was. Having proper baths also became a sign that a city had fully embraced Roman culture, usually alongside forums, amphitheaters, and temples, forming the heart of the city. So bathing was not just for cleanliness, it was a sign of being part of a civilization. However, the way baths were built and used could vary by region. In Syria, for example, baths might show off Eastern architectural styles and even allow men and women to mingle, which was different from Roman norms. Celtic influences could be seen in the bathing routines in Britain, while in Egypt, the designs were a mix of older Hellenistic styles and Roman ones, creating unique spaces with beautiful courtyards and the scent of incense in the air. Despite these local differences, the experience of visiting a Roman bath was something shared across the empire, creating a sense of unity. It made the vast empire feel more connected, offering a piece of Rome even in the most distant lands. Unfortunately, the grandeur of the Roman baths didn't last forever. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Roman Empire started to decline, so did the great bathhouses. What was once a daily ritual for millions began to fall apart. Several issues played a part in this decline. The empire's economy was struggling with problems like inflation, military overspending, and political instability, making it hard to keep up with the costs of running the baths. These expenses included paying workers, supplying fuel for heating, and maintaining the aqueducts that supplied the water. Speaking of aqueducts, as the empire's infrastructure began to crumble, so did these crucial water sources. Some aqueducts were left to decay, others were destroyed during invasions. Without a reliable water supply, the baths couldn't function. The rooms that were once filled with steam and lively conversations went silent, and the beautifully crafted marble halls were left to dry up. Over time, these places that were once bustling with life and activity slowly turned into ruins, a reminder of the glory days of the Roman Empire. The halls were silent, and religion played a big role in this. As Christianity grew, public baths, especially those where people were naked or mixed genders, started to be viewed differently. Church leaders thought these baths were all about pagan fun and caring too much about looks. While some Christian emperors tried to keep the baths for public health, others closed them or turned them into churches, monasteries, or offices. But the idea of Roman baths stuck around. In the Islamic world, the tradition of baths continued with hammams, which kept a lot of the Roman practices like heated rooms, steam treatments, and group cleaning rituals. These spread through the Middle East and North Africa, mixing Roman bathing traditions with new religious and cultural ideas. Back in Europe, during the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, spa and mineral baths became a big deal again. Places like Bath in England and Baden-Baden in Germany made bathing popular as a way to heal and hang out, kind of like the Romans did, even though the empire was long gone. Today, we're still fascinated by the ruins of Roman baths. Places like the Baths of Caracalla, the Stabian Baths in Pompeii, and lots of other spots remind us that Rome wasn't just about conquering with swords. It was also about comfort, engineering, and rituals that everyone shared. Roman baths might be in ruins, but their essence is still with us in our gyms, spas, hot showers, and those quiet moments when we take care of ourselves. It's like every time we enjoy a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're living a bit of Roman life, with steam rising, tension melting away, and time slowing down, just like it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine was more than just science. It was a spiritual practice that happened in temples, homes, and the realm of the gods. Healing wasn't just about fixing physical problems, it was also a spiritual art. So when you were sick, the person treating you might also say a spell while putting a poultice on your wound. This was because Egyptian medicine was really tied up with their religion. Getting sick wasn't just seen as getting hurt or an infection. It was much more than that. In ancient times, people believed that getting sick could be due to various reasons, like the anger of a god, the presence of an evil spirit, or even a disturbance in the cosmic order. To combat these issues, doctors, known as tubunu, didn't work by themselves. They teamed up with priests who were experts in rituals and spells. This partnership created a powerful combination of treatments, one focusing on medical remedies and the other on spiritual protection. Temples were important places not just for praying, but also for healing. Some temples, especially those dedicated to Imhotep, a revered architect, physician, and later considered a divine healer, functioned like early hospitals. People would spend the night there, hoping to have dreams sent by the gods that would reveal the cause of their sickness or how to cure it. This practice, known as incubation, was a well-regarded way to diagnose illnesses. Becoming a physician in those times was no easy feat. They had to study extensively, poring over texts like the Ebers' Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which contained hundreds of remedies, surgical procedures, and case studies. These ancient documents prove that Egyptians were keen observers who documented symptoms, tracked outcomes, and came up with quite advanced medical techniques, ranging from stitching up wounds to taking care of teeth. However, it wasn't all about physical treatments. Many remedies involved spells to fight off evil spirits. For example, treating a broken bone wasn't just about using honey and linen for bandages. It also involved reciting spells. What we see as mental illness today was considered back then to be caused by spiritual problems, often requiring a priest or magician's intervention. To modernize, blending medicine with magic might seem odd, but for the Egyptians it made perfect sense. They saw health as involving the body, mind, and spirit all together. To heal one aspect, you had to address them all. Being a healer in ancient Egypt meant you had to be adept in both the practical side of medicine and the spiritual realm, using both hands, one for mixing herbs and the other for invoking the gods' help. Even without modern tools like stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians were highly skilled. They relied heavily on their senses and experiences, mastering the art of visual diagnosis, feeling for pulses, examining wounds closely, and picking up on the smallest signs of disease. To figure out what was wrong with someone, even if the ancient Egyptians thought it might be a spiritual issue, they always started by looking closely. The doctors of the time would check out how a patient was standing or sitting, their skin color, how they were breathing, and even what their pee or poop looked like. They were trying to pick up on any hints, asking questions like whether swelling was soft or hard, or if any fluids coming out of the body smelled weird. This wasn't just them making wild guesses. They wrote everything down, compared notes, and shared their findings across generations. The pulse was super important to them. They called it the speech of the heart. They believed the heart was like the main hub for a network of channels, kind of like irrigation canals that carried air, blood, and spirit throughout the body. If your pulse was off, they thought it meant something was wrong in one of those channels. Even though their ideas about anatomy weren't exactly spot on, they often got things right when it came to linking symptoms to actual health problems, which helped them come up with treatments that made sense. However, if they couldn't find a physical reason for someone's illness, they'd start thinking it was caused by something spiritual. Maybe it was a punishment from a god, a curse from an enemy, or a spirit that was hanging around the person. Figuring this out wasn't just about looking at the patient anymore. It involved talking to priests or magicians, interpreting dreams, or even looking at the stars and the behavior of sacred animals to get answers. In documents like the Ebers Papyrus, they grouped diseases based on what they saw happening over and over again. They might not have always understood why something was happening, but they had a good handle on what was likely to happen next, like how an infected wound would get worse or how a fever might progress. This knowledge helped them decide how to treat different problems. And interestingly, they were pretty good at telling when something was a physical problem versus when it was something more mystical. If you could see, smell, and treat a wound, you didn't need magic. But if they tried everything and it didn't work, that's when they'd call on the gods for help. To the people of ancient Egypt, the world was full of things they couldn't see, but they used their sharp eyes and minds to make sense of it as best as they could. Ancient Egyptian physicians were really skilled, using their careful hands and centuries of wisdom to see what couldn't be seen directly. When it came to treating people, they had an amazing collection of cures and mixtures. Instead of modern pills and shots, their medicine cabinets were full of herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils. They often used these alongside surgery and ritual chants, creating a treatment approach that mixed natural science with spiritual beliefs. Central to their medical knowledge was the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page document dating back to around 1550 BC. The ancient medical text, known as the Ebers Papyrus, is a fascinating document that contains over 700 different prescriptions for a wide range of ailments, including stomach pain, toothaches, skin diseases, and issues related to fertility. Each recipe was carefully crafted not just for the specific disease, but also considering the patient's body and social status. The instructions were detailed, covering how to mix the ingredients, the timing, and how to apply them. One of their go-to ingredients was honey, valued for its antimicrobial properties, which are recognized even today in modern wound care. They used honey to treat cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixing it with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. Other ingredients in their medical arsenal included garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh. These weren't chosen just for their smell, but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties as well. Their pharmacopoeia also included more exotic, and to our modern sensibilities, somewhat grotesque ingredients. This included crocodile dung, which was used as a contraceptive, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for cures that were more on the superstitious side. Despite how strange these remedies might seem today, they were based on a belief that the power of an ingredient came not just from its physical properties, but also from its spiritual essence. Minerals played a role in their treatments too. For example, natron, a naturally occurring salt, was used to dry out wounds, cleanse infections, and even preserve bodies. Copper, known for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and mixed into salves. They also used oils from lotus, castor beans, and black cumin for massage and pain relief, with the doses adjusted depending on the specific affliction. A typical prescription might say something like, mix crushed sycamore fruit, honey, and natron. Apply for 4 days. Recite the following spell over the mixture. This blend of medicinal and mystical practices provides a fascinating glimpse into how ancient civilizations approached healthcare. In Egypt, words were also considered a form of medicine. The idea was that speaking a charm could activate its healing powers, showing that for the Egyptians, healing was about both the meaning and the chemistry. Their approach to medicine wasn't just guessing, it was highly systematic, documented, and refined over time. While some of their remedies might seem odd to us, many were effective, and some of their ideas have lasted into modern times. They used ingredients from nature, the human body, and the gods to create their medicines and heal people. The Egyptians didn't shy away from surgery when it was needed, understanding that some problems couldn't be fixed with just a paste or a prayer. They were ready to use a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence of their surgical practices comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text that's around 3,600 years old. This document is unique in the ancient world for its clinical, methodical approach and surprisingly modern tone. It covers 48 cases, mostly injuries like skull fractures and spinal wounds, providing detailed instructions for examining, treating, and predicting the outcomes of these injuries. What's really interesting about this papyrus is its practical approach. It categorizes cases into three types: those that can be treated, those that are uncertain, and those that are hopeless. This system of triage is something we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons had a variety of tools at their disposal, including bronze knives, scalpels, and needles. They were skilled in stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting bones, and even performing circumcisions. Evidence from mummies shows that many patients survived their surgeries and lived for years afterwards, indicating the success of these treatments. The Egyptians were also ahead of their time in wound care, using honey, beer, or resin to clean wounds for their antiseptic properties before stitching them up. They applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures to reduce inflammation and promote healing, and they used opium to ease pain. In ancient Egypt, even though they didn't have what we'd call general anesthesia today, surgeries were likely done quickly and with precision to minimize pain. An interesting thing the Egyptians did was leave things like arrowheads in the body if trying to take them out was too risky. This shows they really knew their stuff when it came to anatomy and figuring out when it was best just to leave things alone. But there were clear limits to what they could do. They didn't venture into internal surgeries or big amputations, mainly because they didn't have a grasp on how circulation worked or how to deal with infections like we do now. Even so, within their own capabilities, Egyptian surgeons were incredibly skilled. They were all about observing, recording, and sharing their knowledge, which wasn't just about experimenting for the sake of it. Their practical approach to medicine really laid the groundwork for future generations, influencing not only the Greeks and Romans, but also the way we think about surgery today. Women's health was a big deal in ancient Egypt, too. It wasn't something pushed to the side. It was a major part of medical practice. Everything from fertility and pregnancy to childbirth and contraception was taken seriously. Women weren't just on the receiving end of healthcare. They were also part of providing it. One of the key texts we know about, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus from around 1800 BC, sheds a lot of light on how advanced their thinking was in this area. The CE is the oldest medical text we know about that's all about women's health, especially when it comes to having babies. It's got everything from how to handle not being able to have kids, to what to do if someone's having a hard time during pregnancy, to dealing with stuff like vaginal discharge. And it's all set up in a way that's pretty easy to follow. What the problem is, how to check it out, what's wrong, and then how to fix it. Sometimes the solutions were just medical. Other times, they threw in a bit of magic too. One of the ways they figured out if a woman was pregnant was pretty creative. They had her pee on some seeds, barley and emma wheat. If the barley sprouted, it meant a boy was on the way. If the emma grew, a girl. And if nothing happened, she wasn't pregnant. It sounds a bit out there, but turns out there's some truth to it. Modern science has shown that the hormones in a pregnant woman's pee can actually make these seeds grow. When it came to preventing pregnancy, they had some interesting recipes. They mixed up stuff like honey, acacia leaves, and ground dates, and used it kind of like a barrier. There was even one that used crocodile dung, which sounds super gross. But they probably chose it because it was sticky and had some kind of symbolic meaning. These were early versions of what we'd call spermicides and barriers today. During childbirth, midwives were in charge. They had the mom-to-be squat on these things called birth bricks, which helped with the physical part of giving birth, but also had a spiritual side to them. They'd say special words to keep away a bad spirit named Amit, who they thought could cause all sorts of trouble during childbirth. And they'd wear special amulets with the image of Taweret, the hippo goddess who looked after women when they were having babies, to make sure everything went smoothly. If things got tough, they had a bunch of ways to help, like rubbing the womb with castor oil, making the mom breathe in herbal stuff, or giving her drinks that were supposed to help open up the body. But if all that didn't work and they couldn't do a cesarean section, it often didn't end well. Even so, the way the ancient Egyptians handled having babies was pretty advanced for their time. It shows how much they valued being able to have kids, saw being a woman as something sacred, and believed that life was something to be taken care of by both the healers and the gods. In ancient Egypt, people had a deep respect for what they called the cradle of life. They showed this respect through chants, herbs, and whispered hopes. To them, magic and medicine were one and the same. Healing someone wasn't just about fixing what you could see. It also meant dealing with invisible forces. Sometimes, a cure was as simple as a word spoken aloud or a mantra, rather than a physical treatment. The Egyptians had a wide view of what could cause illness. Sure, natural imbalances, bad food, or an injury were common culprits, but they also believed in supernatural causes like curses, evil spirits, or even the wrath of the gods. For example, a broken leg from a fall was straightforward, but unexplained stomach pain might be the work of a demon or an angry spirit trying to cause trouble. To combat these supernatural threats, Egyptian healers relied on Heka. Heka was seen as a sacred kind of magic, a gift from the gods to humans. It wasn't just for show, it was a real and powerful force, as tangible as water or fire. Healers used Heka to boost the effectiveness of remedies, protect wounds from infection, or banish unseen entities. Medical texts from ancient Egypt, like the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus, often included spells alongside traditional treatments. These spells ranged from poetic incantations to more forceful commands. One spell, aimed at treating burns, calls upon Isis, the great magician, to cool the burn, just as she cooled the fire that once harmed her son Horus. This blend of the mystical with the medical shows just how intertwined the two were in the quest for healing. In ancient Egypt, people believed that spoken words could turn herbs into miraculous cures by imbuing them with divine power. Alongside this, amulets were a big deal for protection and healing. Folks wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, an ankh, or a scarab beetle, each symbolizing something special. These amulets were trusted to keep evil at bay, prevent diseases, and safeguard both the living and those who had passed away. Some even went as far as placing these charms in bandages or directly on wounds for extra protection. When it came to dealing with illnesses, Egyptians didn't just rely on any deity. For example, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, was known for her connection to plagues. Despite the fear she inspired, people prayed to her for healing. Thoth, the god of wisdom, was called upon to guide surgeons and scribes, showing that medicine in Egypt was never just a straightforward affair. It was a mix of chants, gestures, and symbols, all playing their part in the healing process. Healing for them was about more than just getting rid of pain. It was about bringing everything back into harmony: the body, the soul, and the entire universe. Death in ancient Egypt wasn't seen as the end, but as the start of an eternal journey. This belief made preserving the body through mummification super important, as it was all about making sure the soul had a place to return to in the afterlife. The body wasn't just a vessel, it was considered sacred, a necessary structure for the Ka, vital spirit, and Ba, personality or soul, to navigate the underworld and reunite in the next world. Mummification kicked off soon after death. Embalmers, who were both technicians and ritual experts, started by cleaning the body with palm wine and Nile water. Then they moved on to the crucial task of removing the internal organs, which were prone to quick decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were taken out through an incision on the left side of the abdomen and stored in separate canopic jars, each protected by one of the four sons of Horus. Interestingly, the brain was considered non-essential and was removed through the nose with metal hooks. The heart, though, was a different story. It was seen as the essence of a person, the seat of their being. In ancient Egypt, when it came to mummification, they usually kept the person's intelligence and emotion intact. However, as time went on, even that was sometimes taken out and replaced with a sacred amulet. They would then pack the body's empty spaces with resins, myrrh, and linen. To dry out the body, they covered it completely in natron, which is a natural salt mix. This drying process took about 40 days. After that, they cleaned the body again, oiled it up, and wrapped it in lots and lots of linen. They didn't just wrap it, they also placed protective amulets between the linen layers for extra safety. Every step of this process came with its own set of spells, hymns, and rituals. A lot of these were from the Book of the Dead, which was kind of like a guidebook for the afterlife, helping to protect the deceased from evil spirits and getting them ready for Judgment Day. The person doing the embalming often wore a mask that looked like Anubis, who was the jackal-headed god in charge of mummification. This was all about showing they had the authority of the gods behind them. Mummification was really the peak of Egyptian medical practices. It was a mix of knowing human anatomy, chemistry, and some serious religious beliefs. The goal wasn't to cure or save someone, but to keep their body perfect forever. To them, having a perfect body was essential to make it into the afterlife. So, every detail of the mummification process was their way of caring for the soul. While all these mummification secrets were kept in temples and tombs, the everyday medical practices of ancient Egypt were written down on papyrus scrolls. Their medicine wasn't just passed down by word of mouth or simple home remedies. It was a highly organized, professional setup. A lot of what we know about their medical practices comes from these texts, which were written with a lot of detail and precision. The most well-known medical document from ancient Egypt is the Ebers Papyrus, which dates back to around 1550 BC. So, it seems like the ancient Egyptians were way ahead of their time when it came to medical knowledge, even though they might have been riffing on even older ideas. They had this massive scroll, over 100 feet long, crammed with more than 700 remedies for all sorts of ailments, from toothaches and stomach issues to mental health problems and tumors. This wasn't just a list of treatments, it included symptoms, diagnoses, and even spells or incantations for good measure. Then there's the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is pretty much the old-school version of a surgical textbook. Unlike other texts filled with magic, this one is all business, like something a battlefield surgeon might use. It's full of case studies on injuries like fractures, dislocations, and head traumas, detailing how to check them, what to do about them, and what to expect after. It's a fascinating peek into how the Egyptians could keep their spiritual beliefs separate from their observations and treatments. Another gem is the Kahun Papyrus, which zooms in on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. This one talks about birth control, pregnancy diagnosis, and even surgical stuff related to the uterus. These texts weren't just sitting on a shelf gathering dust. They were actively used by scribes and physicians. Many of these medical pros got their training at houses of life, basically medical schools within temples, where they'd also learn about math, astronomy, and religious law. These apprentices would copy texts, memorize spells, and shadow the more seasoned doctors to learn the ropes. It was all about keeping knowledge alive and passing it down through the generations, blending experience, observation, and a touch of divine insight, often credited to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Doctors back then were more than just healers. They were keepers of centuries' worth of knowledge. And it's pretty cool to think that some of their ideas and practices made their way to Greece, catching the attention of big names like Hippocrates and Galen. These guys took a leaf out of Egypt's book, admiring and adopting their methods. In a time when lots of folks just relied on superstition, Egypt was laying down the foundations for medical science with a system that was recorded, repeatable, and structured. Ink bound in papyrus was passed down with a clear purpose, and even though the sands of time have covered the ancient Egyptians' temples and tombs, their medical legacy is still with us. It's surprising how much of their medical practice, beliefs, and innovations have subtly influenced global medical history. You can still see their impact in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and even in spiritual healing traditions. The Egyptians were pioneers in taking a systematic approach to medicine. They were ahead of their time, categorizing symptoms, recording treatments, and making detailed observations about cause and effect. They even came up with early concepts of diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene long before such ideas were formalized by the Greeks. Their focus on cleanliness, like daily washing and the use of antiseptic salves such as honey and natron, and even stressing the importance of bowel regularity, paved the way for modern public health practices before the term even existed. Their understanding of the connection between mind and body was also groundbreaking. Without the benefits of modern neuroscience, they recognized that psychological states could have physical health implications. What they described as spiritual affliction we might today refer to as depression, anxiety, or psychosomatic illness. Their treatments were holistic, combining herbs, rituals, and social support in a way that was surprisingly comprehensive. Many of their herbal remedies are still in use. Garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow bark, which is a precursor to aspirin, are used even today. Some of these have been refined into modern drugs, while others are available as supplements in health food stores. And although we don't use crocodile dung, the ancient Egyptians' experiments with contraception were pioneering for reproductive medicine. One of the most enduring aspects of ancient Egyptian medicine is how they viewed the role of the healer. To them, a physician wasn't just someone who treated physical ailments. They were someone who understood and eased suffering on a physical, emotional, and spiritual level. This human-centered approach to healing has resurfaced in modern holistic medicine, palliative care, and even psychotherapy. The blending of medicine and magic, which might seem odd to us today, underscores a truth that remains relevant. Healing is a complex, multifaceted process that encompasses much more than just the physical. People don't just want to be cured, they also want to be seen, comforted, and understood. Ancient Egyptian doctors were aware of this. Their approach to medicine wasn't limited to just treatments. They used scrolls, amulets, and incantations as acts of care. Although their medical practices weren't perfect, they were daring, structured, curious, and deeply human.